Hey, my name is Benjamin. I'm 51, and I run the shipping floor at Carmichael Distribution. Olivia is 32, dark-haired, and the kind of woman who changes the air in a room when she walks in. For 3 years, I never said more than 6 words to her that weren't about work. Then one Tuesday, she walked onto the warehouse floor in heels that cost more than my truck and told me I was going to her family's charity gala. I should have said no, but something tight behind her eyes told me she needed more than a date. The shipping floor at Carmichael runs on rhythm, and I'm the one who keeps it. Forklifts move in lanes marked by yellow paint on concrete, pallets get stacked by weight and destination, and every shipment leaves the loading dock in the order it was logged. 26 years of showing up at 5 in the morning and leaving when the last truck pulls out, and the hours between are filled with freight bills and engine noise, and the sound of shrink wrap coming off a pallet. The work doesn't ask much of a man beyond his hands and his attention, and I've never had trouble giving either one. Nobody looks twice at the man running shipping, and that isn't a complaint. The drivers know me. The warehouse crew knows me, and the people upstairs know my name. The way you know the name of a building you pass every day without ever having a reason to walk through the door. I show up early and leave late, and the time in between belongs to pallets and schedules and the hum of the ventilation system that's been breaking down every August since I started. It's a good kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't leave room for thinking about what's missing, because your hands are already full with what's right in front of you. My apartment sits above a laundromat on the east side of town. The ceiling has a spot above the kitchen sink that's needed patching for 2 years, and the coffee maker takes 10 minutes to produce something worth drinking. There's a radio on the counter that only picks up 2 stations, one playing country and the other playing sermons, and I switch between them, depending on whether I need music or whether I need to hear a voice that sounds sure about something. The chair by the window is where I sit some evenings with a beer, watching the traffic light at the intersection cycle from green to yellow to red, over and over, like it's got nowhere else to be either. Olivia runs this company from the top floor, where the windows face the river and the furniture looks like it was picked by people who think about fabric and shape before they consider whether a chair can hold weight. She's the founder's daughter, and I've heard her voice on the intercom more times than I've seen her face in person. She visits the warehouse floor, maybe twice a year, always with someone from operations beside her, like a tour guide, and she never stays longer than 15 minutes. 6 months before that Tuesday, she stopped at my station, alone. There'd been a shipment delay on the Portland route, and she wanted to know why it happened. I told her straight. The driver had been given the wrong manifest, and it sat on the dock for 4 hours before anyone caught the mistake. She asked who logged the error, and I said I did, and that it wouldn't happen again because I'd changed the verification step myself. She looked at me for a beat longer than the answer required, and something in her expression shifted, like she'd found a tool she didn't know was in the box. Then she nodded once and walked back toward the stairs. I didn't think about it again. That's the life I had. 5 in the morning until whenever the last truck pulled out, then home to the apartment above the laundromat, the coffee maker, the radio, the chair by the window. It isn't much, but it runs the way a well-maintained engine runs, steady and without surprise. I'd gotten used to it the way you get used to the sound of a refrigerator, until the day it stops and you notice the silence more than you ever noticed the hum. The Tuesday, Olivia walked onto the warehouse floor in those heels. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Heels on concrete make a different noise than boots, a sharp click that doesn't belong among forklift engines and pallet jacks. Every head on the floor turned, and then turned back to work, because when the boss's daughter comes downstairs, people watch but they don't stare. She walked straight past the bay doors, and the shrink-wrap station, and the stack of returned goods I'd been sorting since 6 that morning, and she stopped in front of my desk like she'd been given directions to the one place in this building that mattered. She wore a dark dress with a collar that buttoned high, and her dark brown hair was pulled back from her face in a way that made her look older than 32. Or maybe just more serious. She had a folder under one arm and a look on her face that I recognized from the 6 months before. The same expression she'd worn when she asked about the Portland shipment, only tighter, like whatever she'd come down here to say was something she'd been practicing in the mirror and still didn't like the sound of. She told me she needed me to attend the Carmichael Foundation charity gala on Saturday night and that I would be going as her date. I didn't say anything for a few seconds because the words didn't fit together in a way that made sense. I told her I was 51 years old and I ran a shipping floor, and that I didn't own a suit that would get me past the front door of whatever venue her family used for events like this. I told her I was her employee and that showing up at a private family function would look wrong to everyone in that room, and that I wasn't the kind of man who belonged at a table with people whose shoes cost more than my monthly rent. I gave her every logical reason I had, and I had plenty, because I'd spent 26 years learning how to spot a problem before it became one. Olivia listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, she said it wasn't a request. Not angry, not cold, just clear, the way you state a fact about the weather, when you've already checked the radar and know what's coming. I asked her why she was asking me. Of all the people she could have asked, and she paused for long enough that I could hear the ventilation system rattling in the duct above us. Then she said, "Because you don't lie to me, and tonight I need someone who won't." I should have pushed harder. I should have asked what she meant by that, or told her that whatever game she was playing, I wasn't built for it, that I was the wrong piece on the wrong board. But there was something in the way she stood there, the way her shoulders held a tension that looked like it had been there for months, that made me think this wasn't about a date at all. She was asking because she needed something, and the need was so visible in the tightness around her jaw that I couldn't make myself say no one more time, even though I wanted to. She reached into the folder and pulled out a card, a stiff white rectangle with an address and a time printed on it in dark ink, and she set it on my desk without pushing it toward me or pulling her hand back too fast. Then she walked away, heels clicking on concrete, and she didn't look back. I watched her until she reached the stairs, and then I picked up the card and read it twice, and then I put it in my shirt pocket and went back to sorting the returned goods. That night I sat in the chair by the window with the card in my hand, turning it over like it might have something written on the back, though it didn't. I set it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, and I went to bed, and when I woke up, it was still there, and I picked it up again. A man who fixes things for a living knows when a problem isn't going to fix itself, and this was one of those problems, the kind that sits in the middle of the floor and waits for you to decide whether you're going to walk around it or pick it up. The address on the card wasn't the venue, but a tailor shop on the west side of town, tucked between a shoe repair place and a store that sold nothing but candles, with a small brass bell on the door that rang when I walked in. A man named Gerald stood behind a low wooden platform with a measuring tape draped around his neck, and he looked at me the way a carpenter looks at a piece of lumber, already calculating what he'd need to make it work. Gerald measured me with quick, practiced hands, calling out numbers to no one in particular, while I stood with my arms out and my chin up and my work boots still on, feeling like a piece of inventory that had been moved to the wrong shelf. The suit he pulled from the back was dark charcoal, single-breasted, with a simple cut that didn't try to pretend I was something I wasn't. It fit across my shoulders in a way that nothing I'd ever worn had fit, and when I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, I barely recognized the man standing there, not because he looked like someone else, but because he looked like a version of me I'd stopped imagining years ago. Olivia appeared in the doorway of the shop while I was still standing in front of the mirror, and she looked me over the way you'd check a shipment for damage, quick and thorough, and nodded once when she reached my face. For the first time since the warehouse floor, I noticed something fragile in the way she held herself, a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there when she was giving me instructions, like the act of checking on me was the one part of the evening she hadn't rehearsed. She told me the suit looked right, and she thanked me, and her voice when she said it was quiet, in a way that made me think she actually meant it. I drove home in the jacket because I didn't want to wrinkle it on the hanger in the back seat, and the whole way there, I kept catching the fabric in my peripheral vision, dark and smooth against the steering wheel, and it felt like wearing someone else's skin. I felt ridiculous, and I felt something else I couldn't name, something that sat in my chest the way a good tool sits in your hand when you finally find the right one after using the wrong size for years. Saturday evening, I drove my truck toward the address on the card, following the GPS on my phone through neighborhoods that got wider and greener with every mile, until the houses turned into estates and the streets turned into private drives. The venue was a stone manor at the end of a circular drive, with valets in vests taking cars at the front door and string lights woven through the branches of trees that had probably been growing since before my grandfather was born. A string quartet was playing somewhere inside, and the sound drifted out through open French doors like the place itself was exhaling. I parked around the corner, not because I was embarrassed of the truck, but because I didn't want a valet touching it, and I didn't want anyone seeing what I'd driven here in before I'd even gotten through the front door. I walked the rest of the way in the suit and the shoes Gerald had given me, and the gravel under my feet made a sound that didn't match the music, rough and plain, where everything else was polished and arranged. Olivia was waiting at the entrance in a black gown that followed the shape of her before falling to the floor, her dark brown hair pinned up with small earrings catching the light from the chandelier behind her. She looked like she'd been grown in this place, like the stone walls and the string quartet and the candlelight had been built around her instead of the other way around. She saw me coming and didn't smile, but the tightness in her jaw eased by a fraction, and she reached out and took my arm without asking, her hand steady and cool through the sleeve of the jacket. She gave me instructions as we walked toward the doors, her voice low and even, like she was reading off a checklist she'd written days ago. Stay close, don't answer questions about your work, smile when I smile, and if anyone asks you a direct question, defer to me. I asked her what I should say if someone asked who I was, and she looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "Let me handle that." And something in the way she said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the way it does when a machine makes a sound you've never heard before and you know something's about to change. The ballroom opened up in front of us like the inside of a clock, all polished surfaces and carefully arranged parts moving in patterns I couldn't read yet. High ceilings with chandeliers that threw light in directions that made every glass on every table glow white tablecloths that reached the floor. Champagne flutes arranged in rows that caught the candlelight like they'd been set there by someone who measures for a living. A silent auction table ran along the far wall, draped in dark fabric, with items displayed under glass that I couldn't guess the value of if I'd had a year to think about it. Eyes turned toward us as we entered. Not hostile, not warm, just assessing, the way a buyer looks at a shipment before they sign for it, checking for damage and deciding whether it's worth the asking price. I felt every one of those looks land on me and then slide away, not because I wasn't worth looking at, but because they'd already decided what I was, and the decision didn't require a second glance. Olivia kept her hand on my arm and moved through the room the way a compass needle moves, steady and certain, toward whatever direction she'd chosen. Her family sat at the head table near the far wall, and I spotted them before she pointed them out. An older man with silver hair and a straight back, the kind of posture that comes from decades of people standing when you enter a room. A woman beside him in pearls and a pale dress, who looked like she'd been carved from marble and then polished, every feature in its right place and no expression to speak of. A younger man, with Olivia's jawline, standing too close to a blonde who kept checking her phone, and a few other faces I didn't recognize, but who carried themselves like they'd been sitting at that table for years. Olivia introduced me to people as we moved through the room, and every time she said my name, she stopped at just the first word, Benjamin, with no title or explanation or reference to shipping floors or forklifts or how we knew each other. Just my name, spoken the way you'd name a piece on a board, present and accounted for but without explaining what it does or where it came from. People nodded and moved on, their curiosity filed away for later, and I watched them go the same way I watched the warehouse floor, tracking who's moving, who's standing still, and who's pretending not to stare. It was the first time all night I felt steady, because reading a room is something I know how to do, and it doesn't matter if the room is full of pallets or champagne flutes, the skill is the same. You watch the patterns, you notice who's working and who's coasting, and you figure out where the pressure points are before they figure out you. That evening, I decided the pressure point was the head table, and that whatever was coming next would come from there, because that was the direction Olivia kept not looking the way you don't look at a thing you're expecting to move. And she was right to expect it, because the silver-haired man at that table had just set his napkin down and was pushing his chair back, and the whole room knew what that meant before he did. Then, her father stands up from the head table and starts walking toward us. The string quartet is still playing, but it sounds farther away now, like someone turned a dial and pulled the music back a room. Olivia's hand on my arm tightens, not enough for anyone else to see, but I feel it through the fabric of the jacket, and I know whatever's about to happen is the thing she's been building toward since she walked onto the warehouse floor in those heels. He's tall, silver-haired, and he carries himself like a man who has never once been told no and has never needed to ask a question he didn't already know the answer to. His wife walks beside him, pearls motionless against her collarbone, and the two of them move through the crowd, the way a current moves through water, people parting and then closing again behind them, like they were never there at all. When they reach us, her father extends his hand to me, and I'm about to take it when Olivia steps half in front of me and places her hand flat on my chest. She says, "Dad, this is my husband, Benjamin." The word hangs in the air between us like smoke. My lungs lock, and my hands go still at my sides because I don't know what to do with them. And the only thing I can hear is the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears and the distant scrape of the string quartet playing something I don't recognize. The ballroom doesn't stop because people at events like this have been trained not to stop. But I can feel the attention shift, the way a warehouse floor goes quiet when something falls off a shelf and nobody wants to be the first one to look. Her father's face doesn't change. He's spent a lifetime keeping his expression where he wants it, and whatever is moving behind his eyes right now, whether it's anger or calculation or something else, it stays where he put it. Her mother's champagne glass pauses halfway to her lips, and that tiny hesitation is the only crack in the surface, the only sign that what Olivia just said landed anywhere at all. I can't look at Olivia, and I can't look away from her father, stuck between the two of them in a silence that has nowhere to go. Olivia doesn't flinch. She says it again, calmer this time, like she's confirming a delivery time, the way you'd repeat a number to make sure the person on the other end wrote it down. "We married last spring. I wanted to tell you on my own terms." Her voice doesn't waver, and her hand stays on my chest, and I can feel her fingertips pressing through the fabric, firm and deliberate, like she's holding me in place the same way you hold the door open when you're waiting for someone to walk through. The silence lasts 4 seconds, but it feels like 4 minutes, and then her father reaches out, takes my hand, and shakes it once. Firm and brief and deliberate, the kind of handshake that ends a negotiation instead of starting one. He says, "Well, we'll talk later," and then he turns and walks back toward the head table, and his wife follows him without looking at me or at Olivia, and the crowd closes behind them like water over a stone. I'm still standing there with Olivia's hand on my chest, and the echo of the word husband sitting in the air where she left it, and I don't know whether to breathe or speak or turn around and walk out the French doors into the garden and keep walking until I find my truck. The only thing I know for certain is that I've been dropped into the middle of something I didn't see coming, and the woman who put me here is still standing beside me, holding my arm like an anchor, and her fingers haven't stopped trembling. The gala continued around us, but the temperature in the room had changed, the way a warehouse changes when someone important walks through, and everyone goes back to work, but moves a little faster and speaks a little quieter. People approached the head table differently, now leaning in instead of standing back, and the whispers that had been about the silent auction and the wine had shifted to something with a different weight, something that carried my name in it whether I could hear it or not. Olivia's brother found us near the bar 20 minutes later, a glass of whiskey in one hand and an expression split between amusement and suspicion, like he'd been watching a card game and someone just laid down a hand he didn't expect. He was younger than Olivia by a few years, with the same jawline, but softer edges, and he regarded me the way you'd size up a replacement part that showed up in the wrong shipment. He asked me what I did, and I told him the truth because I couldn't think of a lie that would hold up in this room full of people who could probably smell one from across a ballroom. I said I ran the shipping floor, and he laughed. Not cruelly, but the way you laugh when someone confirms something you'd already guessed, and he walked away shaking his head with the kind of amusement that comes from watching a show you didn't buy a ticket for. An uncle stopped by to size me up a few minutes. After that, an older man with a gold watch and a handshake he never offered. He looked me up and down, took a sip of his drink, and said something about interesting choices before moving on to the next conversation without waiting for a response. I didn't need one, because the comment wasn't about me, it was about Olivia, and the choice she'd made, and the fact that everyone in this room was now recalculating what they thought they knew about the woman who'd just walked in with a husband none of them had heard of. Olivia stayed close to me through all of it, her hand on my arm or her shoulder near mine, and her composure didn't crack the way I'd expected it to. She moved through conversations the same way she moved through the warehouse floor, efficient and alert, answering questions without volunteering information and redirecting attention before it could settle anywhere uncomfortable. But I noticed her fingers trembling once. Just for a second, when she reached for her wine glass on the table, a vibration so small that no one else in the room would have caught it, and I knew it. Because I notice small things that don't work the way they're supposed to. That's what I do for a living. I didn't call attention to it. I shifted slightly closer, so her shoulder touched mine and I didn't say anything about it or look at her or make it a thing. I just moved, the same way you'd put a hand on a machine that's vibrating too hard, not to fix it, but to let it know something's holding it steady. She exhaled, just barely, and I felt it against my arm, and the trembling in her fingers stopped. But the night wasn't done with us yet, because the one thing I still didn't have was an answer to the question that had been sitting in my chest since she said that word, and I wasn't going to find it standing next to the bar, pretending to drink champagne I couldn't afford. I found a side door near the back of the ballroom and stepped out onto a stone terrace that overlooked a garden I couldn't see. Just dark shapes, and the smell of cut grass, and the faint sound of a fountain somewhere below. The night air hit my face and I breathed for the first time since her father walked away a real breath, the kind that goes all the way down and lets your lungs know they're allowed to work again. I stood there with my hands on the stone railing and the cool air moving across the back of my neck, and I let the silence do what silence does, which is give a man room to hear what his own head is saying. Olivia followed me out a minute later, and she stood beside me, but she didn't touch me this time, and the distance was deliberate. The way you step back from a machine before you start explaining what went wrong with it. She didn't say anything for a while, and I didn't push her, because I've worked enough breakdowns to know that sometimes the person who can fix it needs a minute before they can find the words. When she finally spoke, she told me everything. Her father had been pressuring her for 2 years to marry a man from another company. A merger, dressed up as a wedding, a deal where she'd be the signing bonus, and her consent was a formality he'd stopped pretending to care about. She'd been refusing since the start, and last month he'd given her an ultimatum: announce an engagement by the end of the quarter, or he'd arrange one himself and she'd smile at the reception whether she wanted to or not. She needed to show up tonight with someone who couldn't be bought, couldn't be threatened, and couldn't be controlled by her father's money, or his disapproval, or the weight of a family name that could crush a person without meaning to. She needed someone real in a room built on pretense, someone who would look her father in the eye and not bend, the same way I'd looked at her 6 months ago when she asked about the Portland shipment, and I gave her the truth instead of the answer she might have wanted. She said she was sorry, and that she should have told me what she was planning, and she'd known it all week, but she needed me to walk into that room without acting, because her father would have seen through a performance in half a second, and the whole thing would have fallen apart before it started. She needed it to be real, and the only way it could be real was if I didn't know, and that was a choice she made and she'd have to live with. I listened to all of it, and I didn't interrupt, because interrupting a person who's telling you the truth is like pulling a plug on a machine that's finally running right. You let it finish. When she stopped talking, the silence stretched out between us, and I could hear the fountain below and the music from inside and the sound of her breathing, which had gotten unsteady somewhere in the middle of all that and hadn't quite found its rhythm again. Then I said, "You used me?" And she said, "Yes." And then quieter, with her eyes on the dark garden below us instead of on me. But it was the first true thing I've said to my family in 2 years. I stood with my hands on the railing and the night on my face, and I thought about what it means to be used and what it means to be needed, and whether the distance between those two things is as wide as it sounds. A missing screw can be replaced, and a crooked hinge can be straightened, but a person who's been bending for 2 years so her family won't break her, that's a different kind of repair. The kind you can't do with tools, only with time, and the kind of honesty that costs something to say out loud. I went back inside alone, telling Olivia I'd meet her by the bar, and she nodded without looking up, while I walked through the side door and back into the ballroom by myself, the same way I'd walk onto the warehouse floor in the morning, steady and unhurried, like I know exactly what I'm doing even when I don't. Something had changed in how I carried myself since the terrace, and I couldn't have named what it was, but I could feel it in my shoulders and in the way my feet hit the floor, a kind of weight that had shifted from uncertain to settled. The night had already broken something in me, and I was still picking up the pieces, but I'd stopped pretending they weren't mine. I wasn't trying to blend in anymore, and I wasn't trying to stand out. I was occupying the space I'd been given, the same way I'd occupy a loading dock that needs managing, present, and steady, and not asking anyone's permission to be there. The suit still fit, and the room still gleamed, and the champagne still caught the chandelier light like it was showing off, but none of it looked as foreign as it had 2 hours ago, because I'd stopped seeing it as a place I didn't belong, and started seeing it as a place I'd been brought to for a reason, even if the reason wasn't mine. Her father intercepted me near the bar. He didn't mention the marriage, or the introduction, or the word husband, or any of the things that had turned the air in that ballroom into something thicker than it should have been. Instead, he asked me what I thought of the foundation's work, and he asked it the way a man asks when he already has an opinion and is testing to see if yours is worth hearing. I gave him a straight answer, because that's the only kind I have. And I said that giving money to people who need, it's a good thing. But from what I could tell, most of it was paying for events like this one, instead of reaching the people who needed it. And if you want to know whether charity works, you don't ask the people at the gala. You ask the people who are supposed to get the help. He studied me for a long moment. After that, his silver head tilted slightly, and he didn't respond, and he didn't disagree, and he walked away without saying anything else. Her mother came next, and she didn't speak at first, just stood near me in that way people do when they want to say something, but haven't decided yet whether the room will let them. She looked at my hands, which were rough and scarred from 26 years of pallets and freight straps, and the sharp edges of things that were never meant to be handled bare, and her eyes stayed on them longer than seemed polite, but not in a way that felt like judgment. Then she said very quietly, like she was sharing a fact that wasn't meant for anyone else's ears, "She's never brought anyone before." Not a judgment, not a warning exactly, but something close to both. The kind of observation a woman makes when she's watched her daughter carry a weight for years and has just seen someone else help her hold it. I didn't know what to do with that, so I nodded, and she nodded back, and we understood each other without needing to fill the silence, the way two people do when they've both spent their lives reading rooms and know that sometimes the most important thing you can say is nothing at all. And then the string quartet started playing something slow, and I turned, and there she was. A waltz started from the string quartet in the corner, and Olivia appeared at my elbow the way she'd appeared at my station, on the warehouse floor, sudden and certain, and not waiting for an invitation. She took my hand and led me toward the center of the room where other couples were already moving, and I followed because there wasn't another option that made sense, and because her fingers had stopped trembling and I wanted them to stay that way. I haven't danced since my wedding 23 years ago, and even then I was bad at it, all left feet and counting beads and apologizing to my wife's toes, but Olivia guided me, her hand on my shoulder, light and certain, the way you'd steer a boat that's never been in open water but knows how to float. My hand went to her waist, careful, like I was holding something I didn't want to damage, and she moved closer without hesitation, and the room watched us the way a room watches when two people stop pretending and start being something that's harder to name. The whispers had stopped, because there was nothing left to whisper about. We were either a fraud or we weren't. And in the light of that chandelier, with her dark hair catching gold and her hand steady on my shoulder, we looked real, and that was enough to make everyone in the room stop deciding and start watching. I noticed the small things, because that's what I do. The way her earrings moved when she turned, small silver drops that caught the light and let it go. The faint trace of perfume at her collar, something clean and close that I'd been smelling all evening, but hadn't been able to place until now, when her face was near enough that I could. The tension in her shoulders, the same tension I'd seen when she walked onto the warehouse floor, releasing one section at a time, like a wire that's been pulled too tight for too long, finally being allowed to go slack. She told me without looking up that no one has ever shown up for her the way I did tonight. Not the way I held my ground when her father walked over. Not the way I shifted closer when her fingers trembled. Not the way I walked back into that ballroom alone like I belonged there, 'cause no one had ever done any of that for her without being paid or threatened or asked 3 times first. I said, "I haven't done anything." And she said, "You're still here." And the way she said it made me understand that still being here was the thing. That showing up and not leaving was the part that mattered, and that all the other things I thought I was supposed to do or say didn't weigh as much as the simple fact of not walking away. The waltz ended, and we stopped moving, and we didn't let go of each other right away. The pause lasted 2 heartbeats, maybe 3, long enough for me to feel the warmth of her temple close to my jaw and the steadiness of her breathing against my chest. Then the next song started, something slower, and we stayed on the floor, and she tilted her head toward my shoulder without resting on it, just leaning in the direction of it, and I didn't move away, and I didn't pull her closer. And I didn't do anything except hold my hand where it was and let her know that the place she was leaning toward was a place she was allowed to be. The gala wound down with the music getting quieter and the champagne running low, and Olivia's father didn't approach us again, though I could feel the distance he'd left between us, like a draft from a door someone hadn't closed all the way. Her brother nodded once from the bar as we walked toward the exit, not approval but something adjacent to it, and her mother watched us leave without saying goodbye, standing beside the head table with the same expression she'd worn all evening, unreadable and still. We walked to my truck in silence, her heels clicking on the pavement and the string quartet fading behind glass doors. I opened the passenger door for her, and she looked at the torn vinyl seat and the coffee cup in the holder, and the wrench I'd left on the floor, and she sat down without hesitation, pulling the skirt of her black gown into the cab, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And the contrast between that dress and my dashboard was so sharp it almost made me laugh. I drove with the windows down, and the wind moved through the cab, and mixed her perfume with the smell of old vinyl and motor oil. 2 worlds side by side in the front seat of a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and somehow it worked. Neither of us said anything for a long time, and the streetlights slid across the hood, and the engine made its familiar sound, the one I've been listening to for 11 years, the sound of a thing that keeps running because someone keeps showing up to maintain it. Then she told me she didn't plan for tonight to go this far, that she thought she'd introduce me and survive the evening and figure out the rest later. She didn't plan on the dance, and she didn't plan on feeling something she hasn't felt in years, a kind of safety that comes from being seen by someone who isn't looking at you for what you can give them. I said, "I'm not a husband, Olivia. Not yours. Not anyone's anymore." And she said, "I know. But you were real tonight, and that's more than anyone's ever been." I pulled up outside her building, a tall place with a doorman standing under a brass awning, and the difference between where she was going and where I was headed sat between us on the seat like a wrench left on the wrong shelf. She reached for the door handle and paused, turning to look at me in the dim light of the cab, and said, "I need to fix this. What I did to you, what I did to us before we even had a chance to be real." I asked her how, and she said, "Let me show up for you the way you showed up for me." She got out and walked toward the entrance without looking back, her black gown catching the light from the awning and her heels clicking on the stone steps. But the last thing I saw before the doorman opened the door for her was her hand pressing flat against the glass. I sat there with the engine running and her perfume still on my jacket and the night air moving through the window, and I didn't drive away yet. I sat in the truck with the engine running and the radio off, her hand still pressed against the glass in my mind, and the spot on my ceiling waiting to be patched, and the question she'd left sitting on the seat between us.